You prepare carefully. The words are right. The intention is clean. The object is chosen well. Maybe even the room feels right. And still, nothing takes. No opening. No clean movement. No sense that the work landed. That is the kind of moment that quietly harms a practitioner, because if it happens too often, you start drawing the wrong conclusion. You think your will is weak. Your practice is empty. Your sensitivity was imagined. Or worse, you begin to distrust the law itself. But sometimes the failure is not the action. Sometimes the failure is the timing. In this video, I want to make one thing very clear. Planetary hours were not treated as decorative astrology. They were used because time was understood to have quality. And when you do the right thing in the wrong quality of time, you create friction without realizing it. That is the whole idea. Not that 1 hour is magical and another is dead, but that each hour carries a different current, and your action either enters that current or pushes against it. That changes everything, because most people treat time like an empty container, a blank slot on a clock, as if the only question were, what am I doing? The older view asked a second question first. What kind of hour is this? That is a completely different way to think. And once you see it, a lot of practical confusion starts to clear, because you already know this principle in ordinary life, even if you never used that language. A conversation can be correct in content and still fail because it was opened in the wrong atmosphere. A request can be reasonable and still meet resistance because the moment is closed. An ending can drag on, not because you are unclear, but because you tried to cut during a time that favored attachment, softness, or diffusion. So here's the first real turn. Planetary hours were never just about adding a celestial label to a moment. They were about diagnosing the mood of time itself. A Mars hour was not simply the hour of Mars as a symbol to admire. It named a sharper kind of time: heat, incision, force, severing, confrontation. A Venus hour named a different quality: attraction, harmony, softening, union. Mercury favored exchange, language, negotiation, writing, crossing between things. Saturn narrowed, condensed, limited, disciplined, reduced. Jupiter opened, blessed, enlarged, stabilized through benevolence and order. Notice what this means. The hour does not replace your action. It changes the resistance around your action. That is why this mattered. If you are trying to reconcile during a cutting hour, you may feel everything become harsher than it needed to be. If you are trying to separate cleanly during a binding or softening current, the thing keeps clinging. If you want clarity, but the hour favors diffusion, memory, or mood, your work can turn muddy even when your intention was correct. What if that is why some efforts feel strangely expensive? Not because the action was wrong, because the moment was carrying the opposite tendency. And this is where the Hermetic bridge becomes useful. The old law of correspondence is often repeated in a vague way, but here it becomes practical. The pattern above is not abstract if it is also shaping the texture of the moment below. And the law of rhythm stops being philosophy when you realize that time itself does not move as a flat line. It swings. It tones the field. It favors one kind of motion and another. So planetary hours are not random labels attached to a schedule. They are an attempt to read which tide is moving through the hour. That is the first half of the puzzle. Now the deeper part is this. Wrong timing does not only weaken the operation, it also distorts the practitioner. Because once you ignore timing, you start misreading results. You think force alone should solve everything. More pressure, more repetition, more emotional intensity, more insistence. But if the hour is contrary, extra force often makes the work uglier, not stronger. This is where many sincere people get tired. They push harder when they should have read better. And then they come away with one of two bad lessons. Either nothing is real, or I need to become more extreme. Both are costly. The older view is calmer than that. It says, First read the quality, then judge the action. That is a much kinder way to work, because it removes a false burden from your shoulders. Not every delay is personal failure. Not every resistance means you lack power. Sometimes you simply entered against the grain of the hour and then blamed yourself for the friction. There is another subtle point here, and it matters. The outer hour was never the whole thing. The practitioner's state had to agree with the work. If the time favors firmness, but you are inwardly scattered, you cannot hold the line of the act. If the time favors harmony, but you enter with concealed aggression, the operation bends away from its own aim. The old understanding was not mechanical, it was relational. Our intention, inner state, and act had to make sense together. So the real use of planetary hours is not superstition, it is coherence. You stop treating time as neutral. You stop treating every operation as if it were interchangeable. And you stop assuming that success or failure can be measured without regard for the condition in which the act was placed. That is why this subject still matters now. Because even outside formal practice, people suffer from the same mistake every day. They choose the act and ignore the hour. They choose the words and ignore the atmosphere. They choose the effort and ignore the current. Then they wonder why simple things become draining. So if you take only one thing from this, let it be this. Planetary hours were a way of refusing dead time. A way of saying that moments are not identical, and that wise action begins by reading the quality of the moment before trying to impose a result on it. Once you understand that, an old frustration starts to soften. You no longer have to interpret every failed opening as weakness. You no longer have to force every locked door. You no longer have to confuse bad timing with bad practice. Sometimes the work was sound. You were just standing in the wrong hour.